Order. Just before I call Dame Andrea Jenkins, as a note on the clocks, most of them are either telling the wrong time or aren't working, so there'll be no timing of the length of speeches. I don't think there'll be any pressure on time. We don't have that number of speeches. So I'm going off the annunciator clock. Dame Andrea Jenkins, if you'd be good enough to move the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered the costs associated with illegal immigration. I thank the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate and for the support of members across this House, including the former Home Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Fareham, and the former Immigration Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Newark, and also my honourable friend, the member for Strangeford, who also co-sponsored this debate. For too long, this House has avoided addressing the issue that, according to YouGov's latest polling, currently ranks second among the electorate as the most important issues facing our country. This is only surpassed by the economy. We are facing an immigration and asylum crisis in the UK, and we as parliamentarians need to find a solution to get a grip of this problem and win back public trust in our ability to represent the interests of the British people and to legislate and govern on their behalf. Across the House, too many of my colleagues have been reluctant to discuss the real consequences illegal immigration has on our society, our culture and our security, for fear of being denounced as racist by a loud liberal minority in influential positions. Whether that be mainstream media, academia, powerful NGOs who dominate public discourse with their progressive agenda, or even fellow members of Parliament. Mr. Chairman, only this week we saw the civil service unions mount a legal challenge trying to stop the government's Rwanda policy. All of these people and organisations need to wake up to reality. The British public have had enough and they demand action from our politicians. Because illegal immigration represents an existential threat to our society, our culture and our security. And cracking down on this issue must be a top priority. It is a matter that I believe should transcend political divides, and it is a matter of national importance as we as legislators have a duty to the British people to address it. And it affects every corner of our country. Throughout this debate, I will highlight the astronomical costs that illegal immigration has on the economy and the wider society, as well as suggest action we should take to reduce the total number of illegal immigrants arriving on our shores. The House of Commons Library report prepared ahead of this debate took issue with the term illegal immigrant when referencing those crossing the channel in small boats, noting that while a person might enter the country without permission, they have the legal right to be here while they claim for asylum or admissibility to the asylum system is being considered. This report therefore opts to use the phrase unauthorised migrants and includes only those who are subsequently refused asylum and remain in the UK without permission when referencing the cost of illegal immigration. With a fully functioning asylum system where the public can have confidence that the decisions being taken are accurate, this distinction would be, of course, be right and proper. But right now, this methodology is deeply flawed. We know that irregular border crossings have skyrocketed in the past decade, in particular with smugglers now preferring to conduct an amphibious assault on our borders over the previously more common route of shoving people into the back of lorries via the Channel Tunnel. These clandestine groups have caught on to the fact that Britain's asylum system is on its knees. And know that anyone who arrives in Britain and claims asylum is afforded protections and the benefits at taxpayers' expense. There are numerous cases of people whose asylum applications are pending who have lived in Britain for years, many of whom then choose to utilise loopholes in our human rights laws to bolster the strength of their application. This is something the Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honourable Member for Holborn and St Pancras, understands too well. Let's not forget how he, as a human rights barrister, acted for Islamic cleric Abu Qatada in a bid to avoid deportation. He also helped an Iraqi terrorist suspect sue the government over breaches of his human rights. Mr. Chairman, we have seen loopholes utilised, such as a sudden desire to convert to Christianity, knowing full well that their applications will be approved, as it shows they would be persecuted back in their claimed countries of origin. And speaking of countries of origin, we simply have no idea where the vast majority of those who arrive without permission and claim asylum are actually from, making it impossible to determine their application. A Home Office response to a Freedom of Information request by Migrant Watch UK in 2022 revealed that of the 16,510 small boat migrants to land in Britain from 2018 up to the second quarter of 2021, just 317 arrived with a passport, and that's just 1.92%. The total number of arrivals has since risen to nearly 120,000 people since 2018. With no indication that these people have started to make a concerted effort to provide immigration officials with the necessary documentation to confirm their identity. That is a town the size of Watford, comprising a vast majority of adult males arriving without documentation, who aren't forthcoming with their age or their country of origin, and are leaving immigration officials playing a guessing game on who to believe. Home Office figures show that 94% apply for asylum, and yet according to the House of Commons research briefing on asylum statistics published on the 1st of March this year, our annual refusal rate of asylum applications at initial decision has plummeted from 88% and down to an astonishing 24% in 2022. Even 3/4 of those refused at initial decision lodged an appeal between 2004 and 2021, and a third of those appeals were successful. Some may qualify, such as a rapid decrease in asylum refusal rates, by claiming that there is more conflict in the world today than there was 20 years ago. But that just doesn't stand up, Mr. Chairman. There were endless conflicts at the time that we were refusing nearly 90% of all asylum applications, from the civil wars in Somalia, Sri Lanka, Chad, Yemen, and Niger, to name but a few, to the Iraq War and Russia's invasion of Georgia. The evidence can only lead us to one conclusion. Our asylum system is being gamed by people with the help of ever stronger smuggling gangs. Know what to say, they know what to do, and to tick the right boxes and be granted permission to stay in Britain. We are faced with a record asylum backlog. Home Office figures show that 74,172 initial decisions on asylum applications were made last year alone, which is 4 times the number made in 2022. The government will argue this is due to the increase in decision makers. Its own figures show an increase in those reviewing applications from 865 in 2022 to 1,281 in March 23, which is an increase of 48%. But when you factor in that 62,336 of those 74,000 initial decisions were successful, it is a record annual figure. Now, Mr. Chairman, it raises huge questions over the handling of those applications and how those decisions have been made. There is absolutely no doubt that some individuals arrive in Britain through irregular means and claim asylum are genuine people. Fleeing war or persecution are individuals, we have a moral responsibility to help those. And it is right that we support such people, for example, when the war broke out in Ukraine. But it's also quite evident that our asylum system has broken down to the point where it is currently unfit for purpose and exploited on an unprecedented scale. And it is therefore simply impossible to discount those granted asylum when conducting a review of the true costs of illegal immigration. Now, moving on to the cost of illegal immigration on both our society and our finances, we must first understand the scale of the issue in hand, a task that, by its very nature, is problematic. Again, to cite the House of Commons Library report prepared for this debate, the most recent robust estimates of the size of unauthorised resident population in the UK is around 400,000 to 600,000 in the early 2000s. More recent but less robust estimates have put the population between 8,000 and 1.2 million in 2017. It is likely none of these estimates actually accurately capture the situation in 2024. So I'd be pleased to hear from the Minister on that point. Now, that's a city with a population of 20% larger than Birmingham, or 3 times the size of Manchester, living in the UK illegally, utilising the many public-funded services that are available to them, regardless of a person's immigration status, and it could be far more. Public services available to illegal migrants include state education, NHS services including both the A&E treatment, primary care such as GPs and dentistry appointments, and compulsory psychiatric treatment, legal aid and various local authority support. I receive hundreds of emails each month from constituents telling me how they cannot get a GP appointment, they're struggling to find a dentist, how they can't get their first choice school place, or how they can't get a decent roof over their heads. Is there any wonder? Now, the Government Impact Assessment of the Illegal Migration Act 2023 estimated the total cost of providing public services to a UK national is around £12,000 per person. Even the most basic calculations put the economic burden on the British taxpayer or for an illegal migration population of 1.2 million at £14.4 billion. That's £14.4 billion. Just shy of 10% of NHS England's budget for this year. Or imagine that cash injection on the frontline services or to help people with the cost of living who are struggling. But there isn't just an economic cost. Indirect consequences of illegal migration are also inevitable when it comes to wage suppression. Those without permission to work legally in Britain must find a way to support themselves, and they end up working in the gig economy for unscrupulous business owners who offer lower wages and that are accepted because illegal workers will take what they can get, which you can't blame them. In addition, the Home Office experts spend £482 million on immigration enforcement this year alone, and the costs related to the Rwanda scheme continue to pile up to an eye-watering amount. It's important to note that none of these costs mentioned so far even take into account those associated with our broken asylum system. Nearly £8 million a day, that's £8 million a day, currently being used to house asylum applicants, for example. Home Office figures cited by the Financial Times in August last year showed that the annual asylum cost reached £3.96 billion in a year up to 2023. The figure is double that of the previous year and 6 times higher than 2018. And yet, despite this astronomical cost, we continue to increase our handouts to France to stop the boats. Now, I'd really like to hear from the Minister, actually, what he thinks of our agreement with France, because to those on the outside, it's not working and it's taxpayers' money wasted. Now, a House of Commons library report showed the UK government gave a combined £232 million to the French authorities for border control in their own country between 2014 and to the end of 2022-23 financial year. Under the Joint Leaders' Declaration agreed in March that year, we have committed to give more than double that, £476 million over the next 2 financial years. Mr Chairman, I think we should demand a refund from France. The economic costs are endless. It's simply impossible to quantify the true impact this issue has on the public purse. But it is quite clear to me, and a vast majority of the British public, this is totally unacceptable state of affairs. But it's not just about the economic cost. There's a human cost to this crisis also. 7-year-old Emily Jones from Bolton was stabbed to death by an Albanian national, Elitona Skana, while riding a scooter in March 2020. I'm a parent of a 7-year-old. Can you imagine what that family must be going through? Her killer was a paranoid schizophrenic who arrived in Britain in the back of a lorry in 2014 and was granted asylum despite twice admitting to lying about being a victim of sexual exploitation in her application. 32-year-old Lorraine Cox was murdered in Exeter in September 2020 by Azam Mangori, an Iraqi Kurd who was denied asylum in December 2018, but he remained living in the country undetected. David Wales, Joe Ritchie Bennett, James Furlong, murdered in Reading Town Centre in June 2020 by Libyan national Kari Sadala, just 2 weeks after he had been released from prison. He executed the men in an act of jihad. He had been granted refugee status despite participating in the Libyan civil war in 2012. 70-year-old Terence Carney, stabbed to death in the middle of the street by a Moroccan asylum seeker, Ahmed Ali Khan, as revenge for Gaza. I could go on and on and on. These names should not be forgotten, Mr Chairman. They must serve as a reminder of the human cost paid for decades of failure by successive governments and by us as legislators. I want to now talk briefly on the safety of the Rwanda Act that became law just a few weeks ago. Let me be clear, I completely understand this motive and need for legislation such as this. However, I was one of the 11 Conservative MPs to rebel, including the former Home Secretary and former Immigration Minister, who simply could not support it. They, like me, had great reservations that the bill would not be legally watertight and would be derailed by political opponents and activist lawyers and also trade unions and civil servants, as we saw last week when they mounted a legal challenge. However, in principle, I'm in favour of an offshore processing scheme such as Rwanda. We need a genuine, robust deterrent to undermine the organised gangs and the abhorrent people smugglers who sell the dream to migrants that once they have crossed the channel, there will be a relative utopia with free welfare, healthcare and housing for the rest of their lives. We need to send a clear message that this is not the case. Those hoping the current scheme will act as a deterrent will be disappointed to learn that just last week, 711 migrants landed in Kent in a single day, a record daily number for the year so far. So much for that deterrent. So how do we make a scheme like Rwanda work? I'm clear that we must leave the European Convention of Human Rights. I have been spearheading a campaign to do just this via the Conservative Post, and I'm pleased to say that we have nearly 50,000 people who've now signed this petition. We need instead a British Bill of Rights. And we also need to stop those lefty lawyers and unionised civil servants from preventing a democratically elected government from delivering on their manifesto. I truly believe that having a viable deterrent is a humane, civilised and responsible thing to do, and it will actually save lives. We must keep at the forefront of our minds that 72 people are believed to have drowned in the English Channel since 2018, and each life lost is a tragedy. Let us remember that Australia faced the exact same crisis we have on our hands, and through an effective deterrent reduced the number of illegal migrants on their shores from tens of thousands to zero. It's time we rolled up our sleeves and did the same. We must also get tougher on the illegal migrants who have already arrived and living here. At the Home Office's own impact assessment makes clear that 5,700 illegal immigrants who have been identified for removal, the Home Office is in contact with just 2,000 of them, which is just 38%. I'd like to know from the Minister, why is that the case? This isn't just not good enough, but it is a dereliction of the government's primary duty to keep the citizens safe. Such a potential security breach to locate these individuals must be an absolute priority for the Home Office, as well as implementing measures to ensure that this can never happen again. We need to think radically about how to keep an oversight of these people whilst they wait for a decision. Mr. Chairman, for too long the UK has been seen as a free lunch. Study, work, marry and smuggle your way in, and soon you are guaranteed a lifelong all-you-can-eat buffet for you and your extended family. Free healthcare, free education, free housing, free social care, legal protections and access to one of the largest charitable sectors in the world. It is unfair to continue to ask the British taxpayer to pick up this bill. We must take a no-nonsense approach to demonstrate that the British state is no longer a soft touch. Other measures could also be adopted, similar legislation and procedures used by European countries where approval rates are far lower than in Britain. We approve far too many asylum requests. When you compare our acceptance rate to the 25 to 30% common across most of Europe, if you look at our legal system and the Home Office guidance on asylum applications, we make it far too easy for those seeking to try their luck. The damage the issue of illegal migration is doing on our country is untold. It is impossible to quantify. The British public knows, they see it and they feel it. It is substantial and they want it resolved. The ordinary Brit, certainly in my part of the world, is decent and fair-minded. They believe in the value of work and the desire to get on in life. On the whole, they are tolerant of others and show respect for different cultures. However, they are also instilled with a great British principle of fair play. And illegal immigration on this scale is simply at conflict with this principle. In my conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I would like to suggest a 5-point plan we must immediately action to start getting this crisis under control. First, we need to profoundly strengthen our border security. We need to invest in technology, personnel and infrastructure to enhance surveillance and patrol efforts along our coastline, and we must have the political will to use this technology to enforce a stricter border policy. Secondly, we need to get tough on our so-called international partners to address the underlying drivers of illegal migration and deter the crossings in the first place, as it puts people's lives at risk when they try these dangerous crossings. We should be clear, no more money to France unless they play ball, work more effectively and stopping departures from their own shores. Third, we need to streamline and improve our immigration processes. We need to process asylum claims far more efficiently and effectively and ensure that applicants do not go AWOL whilst waiting for a decision. And we can use a tagging system for this. We also need to introduce measures to dissuade people from attempting illegal crossings. This means imposing stricter penalties for smugglers and I'm sure across the House people would agree with that, and implemented public awareness campaigns to educate potential migrants about the risks and dangers and also consequences of irregular migration. It may also mean thinking creatively about how to charge migrants for the public services that they use while they're here. We've got to stop everything being from the taxpayer's purse. And finally, we must also strengthen the Rwanda deterrent by leaving the European Convention of Human Rights, which is the only way to ensure it will work in the way the British public expects. Or let's, as a Conservative Party, commit to having a referendum on leaving the ECHR and let the public decide. The government needs to move quickly. We have just 6 months to get tough. The Labour Party opposite, if they got into power, they've said only last week, they're considering giving automatic asylum to 50,000 people of those waiting for a decision. This is a way to remove them off the books and make the figures look good. They also want to ditch our Rwanda scheme. Finally, Mr Chairman, I would not expect to go to another country illegally, be put up in a hotel, get free healthcare and all the other benefits at no cost to myself. This needs to stop. We also need to stop this pull factor, as this is why people come here. We need to put an end to the soft-touch Britain and toughen up for the future of our great country. I look forward to hearing views across the House, which no doubt will differ to mine. Thank you, Mr Chairman.
Can I remind members who wish to be called in the debate that they should indicate in the normal way by standing. The question is that this House has considered the costs associated with illegal immigration. Jim Shannon.
It would be in order, and rightfully so, that I thank the Honourable Lady for Morley and Outwood for raising the issue in this place. Very happy to be a co-sponsor for this debate, because we can't ignore the issue of immigration. I speak, and as the Honourable Lady has spoken, about the issues that we have, and I'll give a Northern Ireland perspective of tearing that I say in this place as well. The issue of immigration is one of great concern to many of our constituents, not least to those of us in Northern Ireland who, as we had previously highlighted during both protocol and Windsor framework discussions, are at risk of becoming a haven for those who travel to Dublin and then lose themselves in Northern Ireland. Now, if we are to believe the Irish and the Republic of Ireland government hype, it is the opposite way round, and we are to blame for the immigration rates. But no, we're not. And quite clearly, government officials and ministers have been clear on that. The proclamation that they make of "come as many as you are and find refuge," that rang from the Irish government up until at least last week, was an issue which they themselves can make their own decisions on, but then they can't blame us, and I mean us, I mean the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland for what goes wrong. Now we know, and everyone will know, Mr Chairman, that I'm not against immigration per se, and indeed I want to see the correct immigration system that invites and helps and encourages those who are under persecution and human rights abuses. I do believe that we have an obligation to do right by those who need help and assistance, but this cannot be unlimited and done by illegal means. As Chair in Declaring Interests, Mr Chairman, as Chair of the APPG for Freedom of Religious Belief, and also Chair of the APPG for Pakistan Religious Minorities, I, on behalf of those families, those Christians, and indeed those with Christian faith, those with other faiths, and indeed those with no faith, persecution of Christians across the world, they need to have somewhere to go, and we have in the past, and in my own constituency of Strangford, thrown the doors open through the Syrian refugee scheme as an example, to invite some of those Christian families who have been persecuted and who have stayed and have contributed greatly to our society, to our culture, and to the relationships we have. Persecution of Christians across the world, they need somewhere to go to, and freedom of religion, expression to worship their God as they so wish to do, or for human rights abuses as well. We have a system in place for that, and government has made that available, and we thank them for that. I am, Mr Chairman, a faithful missions giver, and the projects that I support long term are those who seek to make improvements in the local communities, to make a life. I understand that this cannot be done in war-torn nations, and therefore there are some occasions, such as the Ukraine scheme, that needed a different approach, and government were very, very positive, very helpful, and I fully supported that. Indeed, I think we all within this chamber in Westminster Hall today, and also in the main chamber, and all parties recognised that we needed a different approach, and we did that. So I thank the Minister and Government for the help for the Ukrainians and their families. And in my constituency, we've had numerous numbers of Ukrainians that we've helped to gain job opportunities in Willowbrook Foods, to gain job opportunities in Mash Direct, where accommodation was available for them as well. And I know the Minister and I had a discussion about this here a few weeks ago, and I gave them the contact names and phone numbers of some of those people and companies that are keen to address this. I know the Minister was keen to ensure that the opportunity to promote those two firms, Willowbrook Foods and Mash Direct, was something that he was keen on, and I know I was keen on as well. I believe that there should be immigration. I'm quite clear on that. However, mass immigration is a completely different issue. This is where Ireland has found herself in difficulty. And I absolutely refute that this is a problem of our making or that we are facilitating. However, the civil unrest is not due to an unwelcoming people. There are a few more welcoming people that the Irish, north and south. The issue lies in not being able to cope with the acceptable levels of immigration. And I support government in their plans to halt illegal immigration while still ensuring we have a fit-for-purpose asylum system. And I think there are just so many. Those Ukrainians that came brought a work ethic, brought a skill ethos, and they have integrated it well into our society. I believe we must always make the difference between illegal immigration and the necessary immigration that brings knowledge and expertise to our fishing, to our hospitals, and brings a warmth and culture that only enhances this UK. I know I've pursued the Minister sometimes in relation to the issue of fishing visas, and I know that we discussed that at our meeting we had last week as well. And it's an issue that doesn't just affect us in Strangford and Northern Ireland, but across the South Down constituency as well, where Ardglass and Kilkeel. So we need to have a visa system in place. The Minister has very kindly suggested in my question to him in the Chamber last week that there's an onus upon the fishing organisations to come up with some ideas. So I've suggested that to them, and I'm hoping to come back with some ideas with that very, very soon, and we can then convey them to the Minister so we can find a system that can go forward. And also within the fishing in the hospitals, also brings a warmth and a culture that only enhances this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It is difficult, Mr Chairman, to find the balance. And I'm aware that this is not a debate on the Rwanda scheme, although the Right Honourable Lady referred to it in her introduction. You can't ignore it because it is a scheme that does give opportunity and does take some of the pressure off government. But rather than one regarding how we can fulfil our moral obligations, whilst also ensuring that we do not sink further and further into debt. And the fact is that the Republic of Ireland and the Irish people are a testament to the frustration that is felt when government are not getting the right message across, and when people that the health and education of their children is at stake and is at odds with government objectives. And that's why we've seen that discontent in the Republic of Ireland, and why there's been such an uproar in relation to what's happening. Whether the figures are correct or not are that the Republic of Ireland have suggested, Mr Chairman, is a question to be addressed. I recently attended a family event in Newton Ards with the Indian diaspora. They come from Mauritius state in India, and there's over 100 people there. And the wonderful thing was every one of them have a visa, they're here to work, they've brought their families with them, and every one of those people, every one of them people are involved in the health sector. So we need them because they contribute to our society. They work in the Ulster Hospital, the City Hospital, the Royal Victoria and local, and every one of them, man and woman, are working in the health sector, and we welcome what they do. It was a wonderful night, and whether they're from the Hindu, the Muslim or Christian backgrounds, and the vast majority were integral workers within the NHS care system. I had a great night of fellowship with them. It was wonderful, it was fun, it was good to meet and engage and welcome them personally, and enjoy some of their food as well. I know I'm a diabetic, the food that they presented was one that I could be able to eat and enjoy, apart from the fact that my mouth was on fire afterwards, but that's by the way. So the fellowship with these men, women and children, and they're very clearly a part of the fabric of Newton Ards and of Strangford. The messaging must be made clear. We need to get a handle on illegal immigration and welcome those who enhance our nation, protect our nation, build our nation through their jobs and their opportunities. So I'm very keen to work along with the Minister and with Government to forward some ideas that we have in relation to the fishing sector in particular, but also I'm very keen as well to see how we can build upon the food sector, where there's clearly a need to ensure that Willowbrook Foods, Mash Direct and other firms in my constituency all have the opportunity to gain the expertise from other places as well, and invite these people in through the legal immigration system. To conclude, Mr. Chairman, we must ensure that these young men who are coming illegally in droves across the channel from France to here are treated differently from young families seeking asylum and refuge. We must ensure that the message that is sent is clear. We will help where we can, and we've done that. And as much as we can, and we've done that as well. And the best way that we can, and we've done that, because we want to see that building. And whether this is on our soil or foreign soil, we must strike the balance of compassion and obligation. I believe we have an obligation to help those persecuted families, to help those who are under such severe human rights abuses. And I believe that we as a welcoming country, as we've done in the past, can do so in the future. So very pleased to participate in this debate and be part of it, but also very pleased to hear, as always, the Minister's response, and indeed the two shadow ministers as well. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Adam Holloway.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I apologise for my voice. I didn't want to interrupt the Honourable Member for Morley and Outwood by intervening on her, but I'd also make the point that the way that the laws are currently interpreted, virtually the entire populations of many countries around the world would be given asylum if they could only make it to Britain. And this is not lost on those making these daily boat crossings. Mr. Stringer, I think I'm probably the only Member of Parliament who has tried to get smuggled into this country from Calais when I made a TV programme some years ago, and I lived in the old Sangat camp. And my observation is very much the same as that the Honourable Lady is making today, that these were overwhelmingly fit young men seeking a better life. Of course, some of the asylum seekers are fleeing torture, albeit they're not claiming asylum in the first countries they come to. Many others are economic migrants doing what many of us might try to do if we were in their shoes. Well, this debate is about the costs, but I might add a point about the costs facing asylum seekers and their families. It's generally the more wealthy people who could pay smugglers for help to get to the United Kingdom. Others face taking out huge loans and become bonded. It's not cheap, and illegal economic migrants are rarely the poorest or the most needy of the people coming from a given country. There are also many costs that have been shared today, but some of them are hidden, and I'd like to highlight some that indirectly affect people in Gravesham. I mention these costs not begrudgingly. It goes without saying that anyone who's come here should be treated with compassion and dignity. But this debate has been called in the spirit of openness and transparency. And I think it's very important. So often I see the harshest critics of government's immigration policy are those who are very well insulated from the pressures and costs that immigration places on public services. Likewise in Kent, unaccompanied children claiming asylum are looked after by social workers and staff until they can be found homes across the country. Staff are recruited from the same pool of potential recruits. I understand too that children from Albania disappear from local council protection most frequently, and the concern is that as a result of traffickers and gangs taking them onward to whatever fate awaits them. Obviously, this is reduced, perhaps as a result of the deal the government struck with the Albanian government in December 2022, one of the success stories of the government's immigration policy. And that obviously is good news. But I'm reliably informed that Vietnamese children still go missing, requiring additional protection, searching, and police intervention whenever they are missing from their home or transition centre. It undoubtedly brings cost to people relying upon the police and social care for support. We've also got to think about housing and healthcare. Immigration has obviously increased our local population, and there's a huge hidden cost felt by people in Gravesham searching for a home or medical treatment. And the purchasing power of the Home Office is keenly felt by local councils and people. We're also getting a great deal of pressure from people moving out of London because of higher rents there, moving to Kent, where it's a little bit cheaper, but that's effectively inflating rents and making it harder for local people. So we've got the direct and indirect financial costs, but there's also the cost of the emotional drain on local people as they try to be welcoming while facing the impact on their own lives. Thank you.
Stevens?
Well, thank you, Mr. Stringer. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair. And I remember the last time we had a similar debate like this, it was chaired by the great Sir David Amess, who we all miss in this House. And of course, in that particular debate, I was the voice of reason against many Conservative backbenchers as they gave a description of the immigration system which, frankly, I don't recognise. And whilst I congratulate the Honourable Member for Morley and Outwood for securing this debate, I'm afraid much of what she said I do not recognise at all. I do not recognise the notion that immigration ministers, past and present, are some sort of lily-livered liberals. It's just not been my experience that that's the case, and I certainly did not like the references to Home Office staff being soft touches and the criticisms of them. I'm afraid I'm going to defend Home Office staff for the work they do. I've always found them firm and fair. They have a regular weekly telephone call with the Constituency Office of Glasgow South West, as they do with other members of Parliament, to discuss cases and where they are. And we have a system which ministers have put in place for members of the House to raise these sorts of cases and what cases should go where, and whether, if there are concerns that we have, and I will be mentioning one today, that we can raise those directly with ministers. Mr Stringer, I take the view that no human being is illegal, and so I think the discourse of this debate, concerns me on occasion when we discuss immigration. I had the great privilege last week of chairing the annual general meeting of the Show Racism and the Red Card all-party parliamentary group, where we had a number of children from London and Nottingham and other places in which they described the importance of having anti-racism education in our education systems across these islands, because I do think that members of this House could learn from some education, and perhaps we should have Show Racism and Red Card coming into these debates, explaining in simple terms the difference between an asylum seeker, a refugee and an economic migrant, because I think that there are occasions in which those who are seeking sanctuary in these islands are being referred to as illegal or migrants, and I think that that is a charge which is completely and utterly unfair. And I don't like this phrase, illegal immigration. You know, if you close off all the legal and safe routes to arrive in the United Kingdom, then you can't complain that someone who's genuinely seeking sanctuary then has to find another place. But what I do find most troubling of all is that the whole discourse of this debate is always focused on the exploited and not the exploiter. And I think that there has to be more of a discussion about how we actually tackle the gangmasters and the criminal gangs. We spent months discussing the Rwanda policy and the Rwanda bill. There was nothing in that legislation that talked about tackling gangmasters and criminal gangs. And I think that that is the source of the problem. And I know it's the source of the problem because I have a constituent in Glasgow who was told he was going to be sent to Canada. He thought he was going to arrive in Canada and he ended up in Glasgow. Now, there are huge, great links between two great nations of Scotland and Canada, but that tells you that there are people, gang masters and criminal gangs who are at it here, and they're the ones that I think we need to focus on a lot more in this debate, and not those who are seeking sanctuary to be with their families, because many of those who are arriving in these shores have already family across these islands. And as the small boats continue, the entire asylum system must be questioned for value for money and effectiveness. And I do think there are some issues which I do want to raise in this debate, some of which I have raised with the Minister before, and he can obviously predicted before this debate some of the issues I'm going to raise, and one of them is asylum accommodation. And I do think, this nonsensical position where hotels are being used, barges are being used, military sites are being used, I think is something which I have great difficulty with. And the Minister knows that I had a meeting with him a couple of weeks ago, along with my honourable friend for Glasgow North, where we do need to think about these issues a lot more. We do need to think about when a backlog is cleared, that thousands of people are given refugee status at the same time, and what that means to local authorities. And I do think we need to encourage local authorities to take more of those who are seeking sanctuary in these islands, but the Home Office needs to do more to negotiate with those local authorities. Because it can't just say to a local authority, you take more on, when the local authority will say, well, that's fine, then tell us what money we're getting, because we'll need to think through what that means for our health and social care system, for example, our education system, and all of those issues. And there is still, I'm afraid to say, Mr Stringer, a legacy backlog. I know there's still a legacy backlog. We were told that every person that had submitted a claim before the 28th of June 2022 had received a decision. I know for a fact that's not the case, and I'm going to raise that case later on. I also would ask the Minister if he could tell us, I don't expect him to have this figure in front of us now, but I have a concern that we know that taxi companies are transporting asylum seekers all over these islands on occasion. There was one occasion last week, for example, where a family based in Glasgow, a Glasgow Airport Hotel, were transported from Glasgow to Bradford and just told when they arrived for their interview, you're now being moved to Bradford. And then what happens is that it's a taxi cost. They're then put in a taxi, and a Glasgow taxi sends them to Bradford. That must have an effect on the taxpayer, as the Honourable Member for Morley Outwood says. But I would like to know how much the Home Office is paying taxi companies in transporting asylum seekers across these islands from Glasgow to Bradford or Glasgow to Manchester or wherever, because I do think that's a nonsensical position, Mr Stringer. If you have asylum seekers based in Glasgow, then why are they being transported all over the UK at sometimes a moment's notice? So I would like an answer to that question, and I hope the Minister will commit to writing to all of us who have contributed to this debate this afternoon what that cost actually is. Now, I want to raise, it was raised by the Honourable Member, the gimmick that is the Rwanda policy. And I have to say, if I was a member of a political party contesting the local elections last week, Mr Stringer, I would have objected to this PR stunt that we saw last week in that Home Office video of transporting those into detention only days before the polls opened in some parts of the UK. I hope that Labour colleagues and others are checking the purdah rules in relation to that publicity. But I do want to ask the Minister is that I have raised with his department why a constituent of Glasgow South West was detained last week. Because under the Home Office's own guidance, it says that those who submitted a claim before the 28th of June 2022 would be dealt with as a legacy claim. That individual should have had a decision on the 31st of December 2023 under the government's own policy. He did not. He has not had a decision at all. So he's not had a negative decision or a positive decision. He arrived for a standard interview last Tuesday, a standard interview to be met with 8 police officers who then bundled him into a police van. He was then bundled into an immigration van, a Home Office van, and taken to Collinbrook because he's been told he is being detained. He has family here. So I would like to know, Minister, why those who have a legacy claim, who have been waiting years on the decision, are now being told they're being transported to Rwanda, because that's not what the guidance of the Home Office is telling MPs. And when I raised it with one of the parliamentary private secretaries, they sent me the guidance, which says that that should not be the case. And so I do have serious questions, Mr Stringer, about the application of that policy and the way it's been applied at the moment. People are waiting years on decisions. I at least agree with the Honourable Lady on that front, and I think that that is taking too long. And I would like to see more staff at the Home Office. If that's what it takes to employ more staff, then I think that's right. In closing, Mr Stringer, I did object to the Honourable Lady's description of the civil service, and I'll refer to my Register of Members' Interests as Chair of the PCS Parliamentary Group. I think the trade unions are absolutely correct and have the duty to their members if they think that piece of legislation breaks human rights or international law. I don't share this view, incidentally, that the whole legal profession is somehow left-wing and Marxist. If only that was true, Mr Stringer, perhaps the legal profession would be in a better place. But I completely reject that on behalf of the legal profession. We have very good lawyers out there, and I think to tar them with this brush that are somehow Marxist is extraordinary. You would think, listening to that debate, that when the judge rises, that Bandeira Rosa, the first 2 verses, are sung in court rather than anything else. So, and I'll just leave that vision with the opposition front-bench spokesperson, who is perhaps thinking about that in his head. But can I say in all seriousness, trade unions have the right to take to court an issue on behalf of their members. And I think they also have the right, Mr Stringer, to have discussions with the Home Office, when the Home Office tell them that they're going to send civil servants to Rwanda to work, and what that means for them and the consequences for their lives and their jobs. So in closing, Mr Stringer, I think what we need is a sensible immigration policy, one that's built on dignity, one that allows genuine cases to come here, to share with their families, and give them the right to work after 6 months. The government is, in fairness to it, going some way along that with its short occupational lists and all of them. I think that I would want to see that built on. But we need fairness and sensible policies when it comes to immigration policy.
Jarvis?
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Mr Stringer. And can I congratulate the Honourable Lady for the Great Yorkshire seat of Morley and Outwood for securing this debate. She did mention the Leader of the Opposition in her remarks. So I just wanted to very gently point out to her that he is someone who oversaw the first prosecution of Al-Qaeda terrorists, the jailing of the airline liquid bomb plotters, and the racist murderers of Stephen Lawrence. Of course, as a lawyer, on occasion, he has had to represent people whose views he doesn't agree with. But I'm sure that any fair-minded person would understand that. I also just want to very briefly acknowledge the contributions made by the Honourable Member for Strangford and the Honourable Member for Glasgow South West, and also the Honourable Member for Gravesend, who soldiered on despite what sounded like quite a sore throat. I would expect nothing else from him. It's also good to see the Minister in his place, as he knows it would normally be the Honourable Member for Aberabon speaking for the opposition on these matters, but on this occasion I've been dragged off the subs bench. Now, today's debate comes after the costs of the asylum system have skyrocketed from 500 million a year under the last Labour government to an eye-watering 5.4 billion a year under this Conservative government. That is an almost tenfold increase over the past 14 years. And that's before the 576 million that's being spent on sending 300 asylum seekers to Rwanda. That comes in almost 2 million per deportee is factored in. So what is the taxpayer getting in return for these mind-boggling sums of money? Well, the boats certainly aren't being stopped. We're seeing record numbers this year, with 8,100 having crossed since the 1st of January. That's up 33% on the same period last year. Indeed, on the 1st of May alone, and the Honourable Lady mentioned this, we saw a staggering 711 small boat arrivals. That's the highest single-day number of this year to date. And the asylum backlog is certainly not being tackled. When Labour left office in 2010, the backlog stood at just 19,000 cases, but today the number stands at over 100,000. Now, the backlog had already doubled because the small boats started coming, in no small part because back in 2013, ministers decided to downgrade the pay and seniority of asylum decision makers, supposedly to cut costs. And the predictable result? Slower decision-making, poorer decisions leading to be overturned at appeal, and a higher rate of staff turnover, all of which led to 56,000 people being stuck in hotels and other forms of contingency accommodation as we entered this year. And that cost the taxpayer a mind-boggling £8 million a day. Now, Mr. Stringer, the dangerous channel crossings run by the criminal smuggler gangs must end. I'm sure that we all agree that. And to stop this pernicious trade, we need to smash the criminal smuggler gangs at source. And to do that, we on these benches have proposed a new cross-border police unit and a new security partnership with Europol based on intelligence sharing. It's part of a practical plan paid for by redirecting funds and focus away from the failing Rwanda scheme. And we also need a detailed plan to clear the backlog by surging caseworker recruitment, a plan which will end asylum hotel use and save the taxpayer up to £4 billion each year. This includes a new 1,000 officer-strong returns and enforcement unit to remove those who have no right to be in the UK. Returns of failed asylum seekers have collapsed by 44% under the Conservatives since 2010, and returns of foreign criminals have collapsed by 27% over that same period. Our plan will make sure applications are processed quickly so that those who have no right to be here are quickly returned. Now, in contrast, the government strategy has only exacerbated the chaos and increased the cost. We heard just recently from the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office, who confirmed at a Public Accounts Committee hearing that the government has defined 40,000 small boat asylum seekers as inadmissible to the asylum system, 99% of whom we know will never be sent to Rwanda. In doing so, the government has created a perma backlog of people whom it has prevented from being processed and who are therefore stuck in indefinite limbo. Now, the government claims it can send these people to Rwanda, but we know that Rwanda can only take a few hundred asylum seekers, around 1% of that 40,000 person perma backlog. So what happens to everybody else? Well, a 99% chance of staying in Britain are pretty good odds for someone prepared to pay thousands of pounds to a smuggler to risk their life at sea, or a human trafficker determined to bring people into the country for modern-day slavery. Mr. Stringer, the public have a right to know what underpins the extortionately expensive gimmick that is the government's asylum plan. So, I'd be grateful if the Minister could answer the following questions. Firstly, could he share the annual cost to the taxpayer of keeping 40,000 asylum seekers in indefinite limbo in a permanent backlog? The Home Office Minister in the other place confirmed that the British taxpayer will be paying full board and lodgings for 5 years for those removed voluntarily to Rwanda. How much is that forecast to cost? The Prime Minister promised to detain everyone who crossed the Channel on a small boat, over 30,000 last year. Given we only have 2,200 detention spaces, what will happen to the remaining 28,000? Staying on the issue of detention spaces, Home Office sources have told The Times there are only 400 to 700 detention spaces reserved for migrants due to deportation to Rwanda. Can the Minister confirm this equates to less than 1% of the current asylum backlog in the UK? And if he plans to bail asylum seekers who are to be sent to Rwanda, can he publish his risk assessment as to the possibility of asylum seekers absconding en masse to avoid being put on a flight if one has been commissioned in the first place? This is particularly timely given that an FOI investigation by the Daily Mail has found that the Home Office has been unable to locate or contact at least 21,107 asylum seekers in the 5 years running up to September 23. Mr. Stringer, the asylum system is in chaos and costing the taxpayer many more times what it did under the Labour government of 2010. The Prime Minister has failed to deliver on his pledge to stop the boats, and the numbers are going up, not down. The public's patience is wearing thin, and they see right through the government's rhetoric. It's time that the government faced up to their failing policies and started to show some transparency. The Minister can start that transition today by answering the questions I've put to him. Thank you.
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Stringer, and it is, of course, a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I just begin by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Morley and Outwood, for securing this debate on this very important issue that I know matters enormously to her constituents, but also to my constituents and people around the country. She is a passionate campaigner on these issues. I would argue that she is very strident in her beliefs and the way in which she communicates them, always leaving us in no doubt about where she stands. And I'm grateful also to colleagues from across the House for their contributions as part of the debate, some elements of which I agree with and many elements of which I don't, but that'll be the opportunity for me to respond to those various points during the course of my closing remarks. There's been much focus today on costs, and I'll address those specific questions. But first, I do think that it is important to set this issue in a little bit of context. A number of factors and forces have coalesced in recent years to create a situation in which vast numbers of people across the globe are displaced and are willing and often able to migrate in pursuit of improved prospects. I would argue that those challenges are only likely to become more acute in the years ahead, and that's why it's right that the Home Secretary is leading the international conversation about what more we can do to try and tackle those migratory flows in a coordinated and joined up way, including in his recent speech in New York. And candidly, the instinct to want to secure a better life is one that we can all understand and one that we can all appreciate. But whilst we're a compassionate and sympathetic country, it is incumbent on governments to be pragmatic about these challenges. Our resources and our capacity are not unlimited. Our generosity, as we've seen reflected so many times in recent years in response to various international crises, is enormous. The British people have opened their homes, contrary to the impression that some have given during the course of this debate. We've seen over 500,000 people granted sanctuary in this country in recent years, an effort that I am enormously proud of, and I think all of us as constituency MPs are enormously proud of the efforts that our respective constituents have played as part of that national effort. But we can't accommodate everyone who wishes to come here, and saying that is not harsh or inhumane, it's just a matter of objective fact. And illegal immigration is unfair, it's unsafe, it's unsustainable, and it also isn't fair to those who play by the rules, those people who seek to come here through those established safe and legal routes, people who, through the various routes that the government has available, pay the application fee, meet the requirements, and that come here. It isn't right when people try to circumvent those rules to come to the United Kingdom, because undoubtedly the bandwidth of government to be able to deal with all of those competing challenges and competing pressures is very challenging. We want to provide sanctuary through our resettlement schemes. As I say, we're very proud of that work. We want to continue to have a fair and balanced migration system where people who play by the rules and meet the requirements can come to the UK. But that is made harder by people coming to this country illegally, and often that makes it harder to be able to help some of the most vulnerable people from around the world.
The Minister give way.
I'll gladly give way.
Thank you. I understand that the Home Office have brought in a lot of new technology in helping to identify the illegal migrants who come over. Would you allude to some of the great work that they are doing? Because I understand we are quite spearheading and quite outward-looking where this is concerned.
I will gladly come to that point, Mr. Stringer, if I may, because it's also been set out in a number of contributions today, expensive. So not only is illegal migration unfair, not only is it very, very dangerous and criminal exploitation being led by what are evil criminal gangs, but it is also incredibly expensive. And it is important to remember that the costs are not purely financial, as I say. There's also an intangible but no less significant impact on our ability to build a strong and cohesive society. And of course, as I've explained, there is the human cost, as lives are tragically lost when people make dangerous and unnecessary journeys. I would argue that the government has a duty to put those evil criminal gangs responsible for this vile trade of people out of business. And let us not forget the appalling consequences of the incident that we saw in the Channel only within the last fortnight, with that young girl losing her life. That is a tragedy of epic proportions. It is impossible for all of us not to be incredibly troubled by what we saw, and the fault for that lays squarely with the evil criminal gangs responsible for putting people in small boats, taking their money, and having no regard whatsoever for whether people get to the other side safely, and simply treating human beings as cargo. And to take a permissive approach to this issue would be an abdication of our moral obligations. And it would also be at odds with the wishes of the constituents whose interests we're sent here to advance. Because it's upon those constituents that the real-world consequences of illegal migration fall, whether through housing, waiting lists associated with housing, GP appointments, strained public services, or at times challenges with community cohesion. I'll gladly give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Minister, he's been typically generous in giving way. He spent a bit of time in his contribution rightly criticising the human traffickers and criminal gangs. When is the government going to produce some legislation around tackling these evil people who are responsible for human trafficking?
I have enormous respect and admiration for the Honourable Gentleman, and he always makes his case passionately. But at every juncture where we as a government have brought forward measures to deal with the criminal gangs responsible for this, when you consider the Nationality and Borders Act and the tougher sentences and the like, and the Illegal Migration Act to make the business model more difficult, and the Rwanda legislation, again, trying to make it more difficult for those criminal gangs to operate, with the ultimate aim of putting them out of business, the Honourable Gentleman and his party have opposed those efforts, have voted against that legislation. We now have tougher sentences at our disposal for those responsible for these heinous crimes. I'm proud that this government has legislated to do that. It is obviously incumbent upon the courts to make appropriate decisions in individual cases, but we have put in place a suite of measures through that legislation to do better when it comes to bringing those individuals to justice and making sure that they feel the full consequences of the law. I'll gladly give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Minister, I know that the government and yourself, as the Minister, has worked tried to work very well with the French authorities to ensure that when it comes to making sure that people don't cross the channel, that there's more activity. Some of the stories in the press seem to indicate, and by the way, government has made a substantial amount of money available to the French authorities to ensure that they do their bit. But it seems, according to the papers and some of the correspondence that I've read, Mr. Chairman, that the French authorities don't seem to have enough personnel on the ground to ensure that they can be more effective. I'm just wondering, has there been any opportunity to discuss with the French authorities to ensure that better ways could be made to ensure that the people don't cross the channel? As the Minister says, what has happened and the deaths that have been lost by traffickers is completely outrageous and can never be condoned.
Well, the honourable gentleman often speaks with real authority and takes a close interest in these issues. And I want to come specifically to the point of the French cooperation. But I can say, in answer very directly to his question, that this is something that is consistently discussed at official level. It is also something that is consistently discussed at ministerial level. And as he will know, we have consistently over time deepened our cooperation with the French to try and tackle these challenges and again make it much more difficult for those evil criminal gangs to operate in the way that we have seen and all the catastrophic consequences that flow from that. Because as colleagues will be aware, we are taking a multidimensional approach to tackling this issue, and I'm pleased to be able to say that we are making strong progress, albeit I entirely accept that there is more still to do. Firstly, when it comes to closing hotels, we are on track to close 150 hotels and to continue to go further. The current situation is unsustainable. We spend £8 million a day accommodating people in the asylum system. That cannot carry on. And to very directly respond to the point that was raised by the Shadow Minister, I would argue that you also need to consider what the cost is of standing back and doing nothing and saying that all of this is too difficult. That is why I maintain that the costs of the Rwanda policy are the right investments to make, because they will allow us, as that policy is operationalised, to dramatically bring down that £8 million a day spend within our asylum system. And alongside that, we also do need to make sure that the accommodation picture domestically is in a more sustainable place. And we are bringing on stream cheaper, more affordable, sustainable accommodation when you consider large sites, but also dispersal accommodation. And we have dramatically reduced the accommodated population. We do need to have accommodation that is fit for purpose and that is decent, but it must also be appropriate to the circumstances, and that is precisely what we are delivering through the large sites programme and through the dispersal programme. But ultimately, the most important thing is to bring down the flow to reduce the reliance and the requirement for bed spaces in the first place. I'll gladly give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful again to the Minister. He is, as I said earlier, typically generous. But he also knows there's the issue, because we have met to discuss this, of those who then receive refugee status and then what happens to them. So can he say a bit more about the discussions his department's having with, say, local authorities like Glasgow and other local authorities who find that when a backlog is cleared, they then have thousands of people who are looking for, essentially, to be housed in the community after they've received that status? Thank you.
Minister.
So again, I think the point about flow absolutely speaks for itself. The current volumes of people coming to the United Kingdom, particularly via small boats, is unsustainable. And so the very best way of tackling the challenge that he highlights is to dramatically reduce the numbers of people coming here through those illegal routes. And that will help to alleviate those challenges. But in the interim, we also need to continue to work constructively with local authorities to try and mitigate these pressures. One of the things that I would most definitely appreciate some support with, and he and I have had this conversation, is what more other Scottish local authorities can do to try and play their part to a greater extent in the national effort to try and provide dispersed accommodation. I want to pay tribute actually to Glasgow for the work that they do in this space, having very much stepped up to the plate to be supportive around these challenges. And we also talked about some of the initiatives that we're introducing around, for example, the HOLO support that was very successful in supporting people with the move-on process in relation to the Afghan response. That is now being rolled out into Glasgow as well, having piloted that support in other parts of the country. The early indications around it are encouraging, and I want to work with him and with colleagues across the House and the local authority to understand what works and where they can help as part of the local response when it comes to moving people on from Home Office accommodation, particularly where people are granted asylum to make sure that they get the proper support and have the best possible chance to go and have successful lives with housing, with work, and obviously school places for any children in place for them. It's also a particular point that has featured a lot during the course of the debate around the cooperation with the French. One thing that I do want to say is that there's often a lot said about that cooperation, but it is a fact that nearly 50% or roughly 50% of embarkations are stopped and prevented through those efforts, through that partnership in the first place, which is not insignificant. If you considered the counterfactual to that, you would have many more arrivals on UK shores were it not for that cooperation. So there is clearly an important role that that plays in helping to tackle this challenge. And more generally, we all recognise that illegal migration is a global challenge demanding global solutions. And the British people expect us to pull every possible lever in dealing with illegal migration. And that's why we've taken steps to significantly ramp up our cooperation internationally. In March 2023, the Prime Minister and President Macron announced a 3-year funding deal of £475 million to increase deployment of personnel in northern France, procure and deploy new technology, and enhance UK-French cooperation for improved coordination and command of personnel centre in northern France, and improved information sharing between our services. The Honourable Lady asked me about that point earlier during the course of the debate. She'll recognise that I'm somewhat limited in what I'm able to say about that for very obvious reasons. We, of course, do not want to do anything that helps those criminal gangs to try and circumvent that work. But the deal is being implemented at pace. More French personnel are now deployed in northern France than ever before, supported by cutting-edge equipment such as new drones, which can be flown over an increased range, and a new French zonal coordination centre is being established to coordinate French deployments with UK officers permanently embedded in the new centre. Our close cooperation, including that new deal, has been crucial in preventing these dangerous crossings. And as we know, last year the number of crossings fell by 36% when compared to 2022. And we know that we must go further this year to continue that trend. But tackling the global migration crisis and smashing the evil gangs who drive it are challenges that must be met with a shared response further upstream, as well as at our closest borders. As such, we recently pledged up to £1 million to tackle illegal migration in Libya amid record arrivals into Europe from North Africa. This money will support survivors of trafficking and migrants in vulnerable situations, while also helping to prevent journeys to Europe by tackling the root causes of irregular migration, facilitating the voluntary return of migrants to their home countries, and providing reintegration assistance for migrants who choose to return to their countries of origin. The funding and support we're providing will mean Libya is better equipped to stop people risking their lives to reach Europe. It also demonstrates our commitment to crack down on people smugglers operating not just in the English Channel, but across the whole world. And in addition to this, the UK is participating in the Rome process, working with the Italian government on upstream projects on the migration route to help address the root causes of migration. In support of this, the UK is co-funding a project to promote and assist the voluntary return of migrants from Tunisia to their countries of origin. It's also been agreed to deepen UK-Italy cooperation on security and economic development across North Africa. Again, it is right that we keep a close eye on the costs of our international partnerships and agreements. However, I would strongly dispute any suggestion that this work is in any way unproductive or superfluous. On the contrary, it is essential that the United Kingdom plays an active role in the global response to this issue. The more effectively we can intervene at our near borders and, as importantly, upstream in countries like Libya, the better protected the United Kingdom will be against illegal migration and the gangs that fuel it. And I hope that that gives a bit of flavour to the work that is going on presently in that regard. We've also increased very dramatically the numbers of returns of individuals with no right to be here. 26,000 in 2023 compared to 14,623 in 2022. We will sustain that progress. I'll gladly give way.
Dame Andrew Jenkins.
I've no doubt. I mean, you're a passionate advocate. We're on the same page with a lot of this, Minister. As a department, have you, has he, discussed coming out of the ECHR?
That is not a policy conversation that I have specifically had. What I will say is that when it comes to the Rwanda policy, to which I think the question is relevant and pertinent, the Prime Minister has been very clear, consistently, that we will not allow a foreign court to prevent us from operationalising this policy. I believe that through the legislation that we have put in place and the determination of the government to see it through, that we will fulfil our commitments that we've made under that legislation to operationalise that policy, to relocate people to Rwanda and to put an end to these journeys of the Channel and the business model that underpins that. I also just want to make the point that Albanian arrivals are down by 90% in 2023 compared to 2022. Again, I think evidence that proves that deterrence work. That is a partnership that focuses on the point of deterrent. Yet more evidence that the general approach that we are taking, one that is developed further through the Rwanda policy, will deliver with deterrence at its core to help put these criminal gangs out of business and to disrupt their work. Specifically on asylum grant rates, I can tell the Honourable Lady that the NABA changes that she and I voted for, the Nationality and Borders Act changes that she and I voted for, are making a difference. I anticipate that colleagues will see grant rates coming down, and we are also making decisions much more quickly. That asylum caseworking productivity, the learning that has taken place over the course of the last 12 to 18 months is making a real difference in terms of reaching decisions on individual cases much sooner. And I know that she's also a strong supporter of the changes that we have introduced around legal migration. I was pleased that we were able to have the first statistical release on that front last week that demonstrates the changes and the way in which they are beginning to make a difference. We saw numbers down 24% across key visa routes. We obviously saw a considerable fall in student dependent numbers, having stopped individuals being able to bring student dependents on the route. We will sustain that progress as well. The objective is to bring inflows down by 300,000 relative to the year prior. Again, this is a credible plan that delivers on the commitment that we have made to bring those numbers down to more sustainable levels, and I'm grateful for the support that she has shown in that regard. But we've touched on this a little bit during today's debate about the Rwanda policy, which is front and centre in allowing us to kick on and make further progress. I think the changes that we've introduced and the progress that we've made is not insignificant, but we undoubtedly need to go further in order to achieve our ultimate aim of putting the criminal gangs out of business. I've said that a few times during the course of this debate, but it is what the British people expect. It is the critical challenge that we face, and I don't think that it's tenable for any party not to have a credible plan about how they would do that. What I'm not going to do today is go into the operational specifics of that policy. We have seen consistently efforts to try and thwart the progress of the Rwanda legislation. I've got no doubt that we will see further efforts to try and make the delivery of that policy as difficult as possible from certain quarters. We've seen incidents in the last week or so with people trying to disrupt perfectly lawful Home Office business to facilitate relocation within the asylum accommodation estate. What we cannot have is a mob trying to prevent, through criminality, that lawful Home Office business from taking place. There is always a right for peaceful protest. What is not acceptable is to behave in such a way that is counter to the law and that prevents perfectly lawful business from moving forward and taking place in the way that I think the British people as a whole would reasonably expect. But she raised the point about judicial capacity and being able to get on and process claims and make sure that appeals are dealt with as expeditiously as possible. The government is working particularly hard to ensure that the justice system can meet increases in demand under the Illegal Migration Act. We've reviewed anticipated workloads introduced by the Act and will increase court staff, secure hearing rooms and judicial capacity to meet those projections. to make effective use of the Act's provision for first-tier tribunal judges to sit in the upper tribunal of the Immigration and Asylum Chamber when requested to do so by the senior president of tribunals. The judiciary has identified and trained about 150 experienced first-tier tribunal judges to sit in the upper tribunal to hear illegal Migration Act appeals. The additional judges, if deployed, could provide over 5,000 additional sitting days. The Lord Chancellor also asked the Judicial Appointments Commission to recruit more judges of the first tier and upper tribunals of the Immigration and Asylum Chamber. The recruitment is now concluding, and new judges will be appointed, trained, and start sitting from this summer. This should increase capacity in both the first tier and upper tribunals to hear routine cases and, in due course, illegal Migration Act cases. Again, we are taking a root and branch approach to this, increasing resource, increasing capacity, making sure that we have the infrastructure to not only deliver on the partnership with Rwanda, but also to be able to try and get through cases more quickly, to try and be able to facilitate greater volumes of removals, not just of foreign national offenders, but also individuals who are failed asylum seekers and who have no right to be here. I'll gladly give way to him.
I thank the Minister again. I did, in my contribution, raise the concern of asylum seekers effectively being taxied round the UK, and could he say something on that? Will he commit to writing to me and others about the costs of that?
I will gladly pick up that point specifically, and he raised an individual case that it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on, in the sense that I would never think it appropriate to sort of casework individual cases on the floor of the House. But if he wants to share details around that with me, I will make sure that Minister Tomlinson is aware of it. But also, on the point about accommodation moves, he will appreciate that we are in the process of scaling back hotels. We are closing hotels around the country. We are on track to fulfil the commitments that we have made around that 150 figure and to go further. But what we need to do is to do that in a managed way. Now, that sometimes requires people to be relocated to other parts of the country for the purposes of accommodation. Again, what we're trying to do is move towards a place where, if areas played their part through dispersed accommodation, there would not be a need for hotels. And again, I come back to the point about flow. We need to fundamentally and significantly reduce the flow of people coming into this country, which goes to the very heart of the challenge that he is talking about. If we had a greater population of individuals who had come here illegally, we would have a reduced need for accommodation. But in the circumstances, what is very helpful is where local authorities work with us to identify dispersed accommodation within communities, which dramatically reduces the reliance on hotels. But let's just contrast all of that to the policy of the opposition, who have talked again about increased funding for the National Crime Agency. Well, we've already doubled that. Talked about a additional team of civil servants. Well, we already have around 5,000 civil servants working on this part of the migration and borders system already. They have no credible plan whatsoever on the issue of flow. Nothing that disrupts meaningfully the criminal gangs. A lot of talk about simply getting on and processing claims more quickly. I'd love it if the Shadow Minister wanted to intervene on me today and give me a name of a country that would be their third country return route, because without that you are simply accepting that you will take unlimited numbers of people from certain nationalities coming across the channel where there is no route of return back to the country of origin. That cannot be right. That is not a sustainable position. That is why the partnership with Rwanda is so important in addressing this challenge. It allows us to be able to relocate individuals to Rwanda with the aim of breaking the business model that is seeing people being brought across and exploited by criminal gangs in the first place. It just isn't good enough to say that we're going to do those two very minor things that the government is already doing and that suddenly the picture is going to be dramatically improved overnight. I don't think anybody fair-minded thinks that that is a credible answer to this challenge, because it is incumbent on any government or any party that aspires to government to have a multifaceted approach to this challenge. We do, it's working, and we will see it through. It stands in very stark contrast, I would argue, to the opposition parties reflected in the debate today. And as my honourable friend set out, the financial stakes are high, but there's also very genuine issues around security. There are very genuine issues around fairness. And most importantly, this is also about saving lives. This is about stopping people risking their lives in the Channel and all the catastrophic consequences that we've seen play out on far too many occasions now. So not only is it right financially, but it's also right morally to get a better grip of illegal migration. As I say, we have a plan. It's delivering results. We've still got some distance to go. I believe that the steps that we propose to take will deliver the results that we intend them to have. And that matters because people in communities like Morley and Outwood want to see change. I think they recognise that we have a plan to get there. Their local MP will no doubt hold us to account for delivery against the promises that we have made. There's nothing humane or decent about standing back and doing very little to stop what we are seeing presently, all the risk to life that it presents, and just simply accepting that it's all too difficult and that things can't change. That's not the position that this government has taken. It's not the position that this government will take moving forward, and we're determined to see this through.
Dame Andrea Jenkins to wind up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank yourself, the Minister, the Shadow Minister, and the few MPs who took part. It's a shame in this important debate that more didn't turn up. I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Strangford, for his contribution, who gave an important insight into how illegal immigration is affecting his constituents in Northern Ireland and the impact on the fishing and food sector, and highlighting the unhappiness by the Northern Irish people, and how we must strike a balance between compassion and obligation. So thank you for that. I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Gravesend, for participating despite losing his voice. I've been there. And described his own experience for his TV programme he was in, and the dangers of traffickers and gangs, and the plight of the Vietnamese children going missing, which is a very important point. And also the impact on how it also inflates rents, which has a knock-on effect for the British public. I'd like to thank the SNP and the honourable member for Glasgow South West, despite having completely different views. I agree with him on a couple of issues about tackling gangmasters and also having a better relationship between local government and central government. I'd like to thank the Shadow Minister, the Honourable Member for Barnsley Central, who is well respected across this House. Thank you for your contribution. However, I didn't hear a fully detailed plan, actually, on what Labour would do. They said they would look at issues. Nor did the member touch on my points on Labour giving asylum to 50,000 people. So this is really concerning. And I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the Minister, for being here today and contributing to this debate. Knowing him as a friend, I'm confident that he is strident in his role, and he understands the impact on the British people. So I'd like to also urge him, so first of all, Mr Chairman, thank you and fellow MPs for their input on today's debate. But Minister, I'm urging you, it's time to get a grip. The British taxpayers had enough. Let's show them how serious we are in tackling this. Let's come out of the ECHR and let's finally get control of our borders, because we know in 6 months' time, if Labour do get in power, this issue will never be addressed. Thank you, Mr Chairman.
The question is that this House has considered the costs associated with illegal immigration. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.